So last week we looked at the question of anti-Semitism, and we looked at the way that anti-Semitism is perceived in the Jewish community. And what's really interesting is for most of the modern period, anti-Semitism was a thing about which the Jewish community was incredibly unified, right? The topic of this course is Jewish peoplehood, and Jewish peoplehood as it relates to the state of Israel and world Jewry. And for a long time, like, anti-Semitism was something that we, the Jewish community of the world, all agreed on. And the point of view of the lecture and the discussion that we looked at last time was that, in fact, we now are unable to see anti-Semitism as a unifying factor of the Jewish people in the way that it used to be. So that was the point of view of last week's lecture. And I'm curious if anybody has any lingering thoughts or questions over the last week, or whether you felt like, on reflection, yes, you agree. On reflection, no, you don't agree. On reflection, you want to hear something else. What are you thinking about?
Trying to remember.
I can do a little bit more reminding.
That would be
Last
good.
week, yeah, you missed my short summary, Mishka.
Oh,
You in last week's lecture, Daniel Hartman talked about his sort of framework for understanding differences in community,
Right.
which is a useful framework for lots and lots of different things. Pluralism
Right.
are differences that we view as equally legitimate. What you're doing is an equally legitimate and valuable choice in the community. It's not my choice, but it's equally good. Deviance is for differences which are unacceptable and intolerable and potentially harmful and dangerous. Like, I do not allow people who behave in this way to be a part of my community at all. Okay, for that, we've got prison, we've got sanctions. In the middle, we've got tolerance, right? And then there's sort of variations of tolerance, but tolerance broadly is a difference which we can think is wrong or inferior, but which we can tolerate because we respect a broader value of freedom of choice, or we think that your behavior is wrong, but it isn't really threatening. Okay, and so for that reason, we can tolerate that behavior in society. And so there's variations of tolerance. There's tolerance that's much closer to pluralism, and there's tolerance that's much closer to deviance, right? Tolerable deviance. And we talked about sort of the speed limit kind of question, where, like, okay, if you're driving at 75, we would all agree that that's a technical violation of the law, but it might be, in fact, the safest way to drive on a road in a particular stretch of highway. Whereas if you're going 85, you could get a ticket because you're going too far out of the bounds, right? So he began last week by charting out this way of looking at the world: pluralism, tolerance, and deviance. And he suggested that in the Jewish community, most religious differences are approached through pluralism or tolerance, right? Like the Reform Shacharit is not the same as the conservative Shacharit, but it still qualifies as a equally legitimate way of observing Shacharit. Like if you go to a bar mitzvah at the Reform shul down the street, this rabbi does not think you then also need to open a Sidur Sim Shalom or a Lev Shalem and pray from our book, the correct words, so that you're fulfilled your mitzvah. I feel like if you went to the bar mitzvah down the street, you're okay. You did it. Good job. A plus. Check. Okay. That's pluralism. All right. Tolerance would be okay. I think that choosing to daven in a minyan where that does not count all adult Jews equally, right? That is to say, men and women equally. I think that is wrong, deviant, like not correct behavior, but I tolerate both folks in my community that daven at places like that and the existence of mechitza minyans, Orthodox shuls, in my broader Jewish community. I think it's not the best way to worship God, but I tolerate that it exists because I believe in pluralism and that people have a right to choose to do the wrong thing sometimes, right? So that's right. Most things in our life, especially religious things, we have pluralism or tolerance about. There are very few things that are truly, truly deviant. But anti-Semitism was one that we could pretty much all agree. And even, 25, 30 years ago, this was true. Like everybody agreed, anti-Semitism, that is a big red line, right? You can't be an anti-Semite and you can't associate with anti-Semites, and anybody who associates with any anti-Semites is being deviant. You are out of bounds for doing it. Well, nowadays, anti-Semitism has ceased to be a shared boundary because of three factors, right? There are differences in our assessments of existential threats, right? If you think that Iran is a greater threat to the Jewish people than anti-Semitism, you might be willing to work with an anti-Semite who is anti-Iran. Okay, right? So that's the difference in assessment of existential threat, right? Here's another example. If you think that the biggest threat to the world right now is climate change, you might if the biggest threat is climate change, you might be willing to work with an anti-Semite who is also working to end for stronger environmental standards or whatever. Okay. So that's another case of a difference of assessment in existential threats. Then there's also the issue of complex multiple identities. Okay, so I am Jewish, but I'm also American. I also might consider myself white, or I might consider myself to be a person of color, or I might consider myself to be LGBTQ or whatever. And all of those personal identities like coalesce around a way in which people might be in my broader community, my LGBTQ community, who might overlap with, but aren't necessarily the same as my Jewish community. When people were just what they were Jewish people, okay, then it was easy to see who was in and who was out. But when you have complex overlapping identities, like you might be in a group that's a group that shares other folks who might disagree with you, and that's part of what it means to be sort of in this brave new world that we live in. And the most obvious reason why anti-Semitism is no longer the clear red line it used to be is because partisan politics has created sort of we are unable to see our own anti-Semites. We've gotten very adept at seeing anti-Semites across the aisle, but it's very hard for us to see our own anti-Semitism on our own political side of the spectrum. So he suggested that we have to be very careful about how we apply the label of anti-Semitism, and we should only apply it if we can meet the standard of both people on the right and the left would agree that this person is an anti-Semite. Otherwise, using the label actually creates further wedge between Jewish people instead of reinforcing Jewish peoplehood. So it's clear from his lecture that Jewish peoplehood is the goal, right? I mean, that's the whole point of this course in a lot of ways. Jewish peoplehood is really important. And anti-Semitism is a factor that used to unite Jewish people and are now pulling Jewish people apart. But we can make conscious choices about how we use the term anti-Semitic in a way that will be better at creating cohesion among Jews. At the very end of last week's class, we started to discuss and point toward this week's topic, which is anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Are they the same? Are they different? How do they overlap? And of course, this directly relates to issues that have come up in our own political worlds, in our own geographic neighborhood in Schenectady. Like, this is a very important piece to understand. And our lecturer today is truly a master. His name is Yossi Klein Halevi. He's written several books. He's a journalist and a thinker. I've read several of his books, and they're all well worth it. His most recent book, Letters to a Palestinian Neighbor, is a very convincing and articulate argument for the Jewish story. And it's good for Palestinians to read, but it's also really good for us all to read as like a re-articulation of the importance of Zionism. It's not very long, it's very short. His book before that is called Like Dreamers, is a tremendous stylized memoir, like a novel-ish type treatment of several members of the paratrooper brigade that liberated the Kotel in the 67 war, in the Six-Day War, and then where they went afterward, up until the contemporary period. And it is incredibly powerful and highly worthwhile and extremely good to read. Everybody should read it. So read Like Dreamers, Yossi Klein Halevi. Now, he is going to share his own personal experience with anti-Semitism and his process of understanding it. And then we're going to stop and discuss it. And then we're going to watch an interview that he has with an American scholar and thinker named Yehuda Kurtzer, who is the director of the Hartman Institute of North America. And so then we're going to also discuss that. So let's jump in to Yossi Klein Halevi's lecture. Let's see. Bright orchestral music. Oops, I forgot to share. I forgot to make sure that I was sharing for video clips. All right, so that's better. Here we go.
In this lecture, my colleague Yossi Klein Halevi will delve more deeply into the meaning and definition of anti-Semitism, the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and whether all anti-Zionism is in fact anti-Semitism. In doing so, he will analyze the differences between the manifestations of anti-Semitism from the far left and those from the far right, and how a commitment to Jewish peoplehood impacts on our discourse on the issue. He will then explore this issue in greater depth in an interview with Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer.
Like other members of the second generation, my life was intended to be a victory over anti-Semitism. We were the miracle children who should not have been born. Our very existence proved the limited reach, even of a total war of genocide. We were given the names of murdered grandparents and told to be happy. Our happiness would be the final vindication of our parents' survival. And yet, our lives were our parents' victory, not ours. Of course, we did nothing to earn our birth. And so growing up, I was determined to earn my own victory over anti-Semitism. My childhood and youth were defined by the need to prove my worth in the struggle to protect the Jewish people. In 6th grade, together with friends whose parents were likewise survivors, I formed the Anti-Nazi Agency. We had read in our Brooklyn Jewish newspaper that neo-Nazi groups were on the rise, and that it was only a matter of time before the complacent American Jewish community was confronted with the very threat that had destroyed the complacent German Jewish community. We mimeographed leaflets that mimicked the language of our Jewish newspaper, warning of a rising Nazi tide, this hyper language, and hung them on lampposts. We collected several hundred signatories on a petition demanding that President Lyndon Johnson outlaw Nazi groups, and we mailed it to the White House. Years later, as a graduate student in journalism, I met my first real Nazis on a class assignment to the Chicago headquarters of the Nazi Party. The actual assignment was to write about any local Chicago community organization, and I chose the American Nazi Party. Here at last was my chance to confront childhood demons. Now, this was in 1977, and the mainstream media was suddenly focused on a homegrown American Nazi threat, the Nazi Party's intention to march into the Chicago suburb of Skokie, home of a substantial community of survivors. For me, it was one of those moments in life of thrilling coincidence. Here I was in Chicago with a pretext to actually go meet Nazis. I sat in their swastika-covered clubhouse and listened to their leader, a strutting little man with a long nose named Frank Collin, and he warned about the all-powerful Jews. And yet, I didn't feel fear or danger or even, strange enough to say, loathing. Instead, I felt amused. I looked around the room and saw not stormtroopers, but a collection of losers who belonged in Mel Brooks's film, The Producers. And Frank Collin, by the way, was later exposed as half Jewish and expelled from the party and then sent to prison for child molestation. Now, the experience that day only confirmed for me the absurdity of my childhood obsession with literal Nazis. The Nazis had exceeded their own darkest fantasies, but their capacity to threaten the Jewish people was spent. What more could they possibly do to us? And so instead of fighting my father's ghosts, the real struggle against anti-Semitism in my time was the movement to save Soviet Jewry. And that became the cause to which I dedicated my teenage years. The most powerful totalitarian empire had declared war against Jewish identity. Jews were forbidden to learn anything about Judaism, and yet Soviet anti-Semitism prevented them from entirely assimilating. And when asked permission to emigrate, Jews were expelled to the margins of society or else imprisoned. The Soviet Union called itself the leader of the world's progressive forces. And so the threat to Jewish well-being in my generation came from the left, not the right. The Holocaust presented a vexing dilemma to anti-Semites: how to restore respectability to Jew hatred after Auschwitz. And it was the Soviet Union which provided the answer. The truly inspired solution devised by the Soviets was to turn the Jews into the new Nazis. The problem was no longer Jewish weakness and morality, which Hitler despised and feared as threats to humanity's capacity to survive the Darwinian war of the jungle. Now, the threat to humanity was Jewish power and Jewish racism. The Nazis' enemy, international Jewry, was replaced by the Soviets' enemy, international Zionism. In Soviet newspapers, cartoons showed the Star of David merging with the swastika, and Israeli General Moshe Dayan merging with Hitler. The Zionists had collaborated with the Nazis and now were mimicking, no, exceeding, Nazi aggression and cruelty. The Soviet gift to Jew haters was to redeem them from the stigma of racism. We don't hate Jews because we're racist. We hate Jews because they're racist. In creating the ideology of Zionism as racism, the Soviets transformed the nature of anti-Semitic threat. No longer the swastika, but the transformation of the Star of David into the swastika. The high point in the Soviet Union's war against the Jews was the 1975 UN Zionism is Racism resolution. That resolution, initiated by the Soviet bloc, labeled the movement for Jewish empowerment as inherently racist and Israel as an apartheid regime. Those accusations, which of course are commonplace today on many campuses around the world, were born in the Soviet Union's laboratory for the new anti-Semitism. The Zionism Racism resolution clarified for me the unique nature of anti-Semitism among the various forms of racism. More than the mere hatred of the other, anti-Semitism went a considerable step further by turning the Jews into the Jew, symbol for whatever a given civilization defines as the ultimate expression of evil. And so, under pre-Holocaust Christianity, the Jew was Christ killer. Under Marxism, the Jew was capitalist. Under Nazism, race polluter. And now, in the era of universal human rights, the Jewish state became the embodiment of racism and colonialism, the most loathsome qualities of our time. Now, of course, those other more prosaic expressions of hatred for Jews persisted. The anti-Semitism of otherness. Jews were cheap or ostentatious, shabby in their poverty or vulgar in their wealth, clannish or pathetically inept in their attempts to infiltrate Gentile society. But those expressions of anti-Semitism, it seemed to me, were within the bounds of ordinary human contempt for differences. Only the anti-Semitism that turned Jews into the Jew risked becoming lethal. The purpose of the Zionism as Racism campaign was to condition the world to the necessity of destroying the Zionist state, a precursor to genocide. Zionism racism readjusted my emotional response to anti-Semitism. Mere dislike of Jews no longer especially troubled me. My focus shifted to the truly existential threat of the anti-Semitism of symbols. What kept me from feeling despair in the face of this latest incarnation of potentially lethal anti-Semitism was that this time the Jews weren't alone. The Zionism racism resolution was almost unanimously repudiated across American society and even in Western Europe. And the campaign to free Soviet Jews was drawing significant non-Jewish support. Senator Henry Jackson mobilized Congress to link American trade credits for the Soviet regime with levels of Soviet Jewish immigration. Christian clergy and civil rights leaders have been part of the Soviet Jewry protest movement from its first days. Meanwhile, America was becoming the most welcoming diaspora that Jews had ever known. The last barriers to Jewish acceptance were falling in academia. Even restricted country clubs were opening their doors to Jews. I married Sarah, a convert to Judaism, a descendant from a Mayflower pilgrim, and from Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch governor who tried to bar Jews from New York, surely one of history's least successful attempts at ethnic cleansing. Thanks to Sarah, Peter Stuyvesant has Jewish progeny. The disparity in experience between my father's generation and mine was so vast that the difference between us should have been measured in centuries rather than mere decades. When Sarah and I moved to Israel in 1982, it was arguably as the freest and most privileged Jews in history, choosing to leave the most successful diaspora community for a sovereign Jewish state. In the fall of 1989, the Soviet Union began to collapse. Working as a journalist, I tracked the falling Soviet dominoes. I was in Poland when Solidarity came to power, in Prague as the Velvet Revolution triumphed. In Berlin, I saw the wall break open and felt an emotion I never thought possible, a shared sense of joy with Germans. The Iron Curtain parted, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet immigrants were on their way to Israel. Back home, I found a country that had become instantly transformed. Unemployed classical musicians played on the streets. Schoolrooms were crammed with 40 or more children. Cyrillic letters appeared on dairy products in the supermarket. This was the face of victory. For me, the most symbolic moment came in 1991, when the UN voted to repeal the Zionism racism resolution, a reparation made possible by the fall of the Soviet Union. With that implicit apology to the Jewish people, the UN seemed to confirm the historic defeat of the anti-Semitism of symbols. True, in large parts of the Muslim world, pathological Jew hatred had become endemic. Hitler's Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were runaway bestsellers for decades in Arab countries. Arab state media routinely broadcast anti-Semitic messages that combined medieval themes of Jewish bloodlust with Nazi themes of Jewish world domination. And yet, there was hope for that sickness too. The Oslo peace process held the promise of ending the Palestinian conflict, one of the main sources of contemporary Muslim anti-Semitism. Now, of course, there would always be people who would hate Jews as other, but that was the mere anti-Semitism of dislike. Only the anti-Semitism of symbols truly threatened our existence. And the war against lethal anti-Semitism was on its way to being won. And now it's back. The return of obsessive Jew hatred was not supposed to happen. The Holocaust should have shamed humanity into an unconditional rejection of anti-Semitism. And with the thriving Jewish state and a self-confident American Jewry and the disappearance of the Soviet Union, history seemed to be pointing toward that historic reckoning. In retrospect, of course, it was foolish to assume that the Holocaust could end lethal Jew hatred, that unleashing the ultimate demons would somehow exhaust them. The opposite has happened. By actualizing the inconceivable, the Holocaust created new norms. If European soccer fans chant Jews to the ovens, and Iranian leaders lead masses of the faithful in chanting death to Israel, it's because the Holocaust happened. The renewal after the Holocaust of passionate anti-Semitism, as opposed to its merely casual forms, is in some sense even more shocking than the Holocaust itself. Now we know where this hatred can lead, yet the infection is spreading and generating new rationales. The resurrection of anti-Semitism after Auschwitz is arguably its greatest achievement, testimony to its extraordinary adaptability. The Soviet Union is dead, but anti-Zionism is its posthumous victory. The UN may have formally repudiated the Zionism-racism resolution, yet its impact has only grown. The UN's hatred for the Jewish state is stunning. More resolutions are passed against Israel than against all other countries combined. As UN Watch, a pro-Israel NGO, starkly put it, a nation with 0.1% of the world's population draws 78% of UN condemnations. The obsessive hatred of Israel recalls an old and familiar obsession. Only Israel is the target of an international boycott movement. Only Israel, among all the nations of our otherwise morally exemplary world, must defend the legitimacy of its existence. Only Israel. We have too easily adapted to those terrible words. Thanks in large part to social media, we face an unprecedented globalization of anti-Semitism. YouTube clips about Jewish conspiracies attract millions of viewers. And even the Nazis are back, this time not merely threatening to march through a Jewish neighborhood, but massacring worshipers in synagogues. On October 27, 2018, I was visiting a synagogue in suburban Chicago when the news came from Pittsburgh. The initial report was that a far-left gunman denouncing Trump's support for Israel had entered the Tree of Life synagogue. That report made sense to the Chicago congregants. Earlier that same week, a man shouting about Palestinian oppression had threatened to kill children playing in the synagogue's schoolyard. The shooter, of course, turned out to be a neo-Nazi, outraged by support for migrants. In the following days on a lecture tour, I participated in memorial services around Jewish America. American Jews, I realized, were telling two very different stories about Pittsburgh. One story was American, and one story was Jewish, and each had a different geographical trajectory. The points along the American story were Charlottesville, Charleston, Thousand Oaks, Las Vegas, Pittsburgh. That was a story about gun control, about mindless violence, about a reckless and inciting president, generic racism. This time it was a synagogue, but it could have been a black church or a mosque. The second story American Jews told about Pittsburgh was Jewish, and its geographical trajectory included Paris, Toulouse, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Buenos Aires, Pittsburgh. This was a story about the return of violent Jew hatred around the world, and which had finally come to America. As an Israeli, I felt confused and even alienated by the American story of Pittsburgh. At one memorial service, I heard a rabbi dedicate the closing Kaddish to all victims of guns. Jews are murdered praying in a synagogue, and your takeaway is gun control? I realized that we were speaking very different languages. When Jewish leaders at these gatherings spoke about bringing the community together in mourning, they weren't speaking only of the Jewish community, but also of their non-Jewish neighbors. And this was also disorienting for me as an Israeli. Who are you, American Jews? Where does your emotional center lie? And yet, I gradually understood that both stories were true to the Pittsburgh moment. Listening to the non-Jewish speakers at the memorial services, what I heard wasn't expressions of solidarity with the Jewish community, but empathy. An attack on an American synagogue was an attack on America, on all Americans. That's what they were saying. We stand here with you, not in solidarity, but as fellow mourners. I recently visited Pittsburgh and was struck by the still pervasive sense of grief. Jews still seemed stunned. The rabbi of the Tree of Life, Jeffrey Myers, spoke very slowly and seemed to barely move his lips as he recounted that morning to me. The synagogue remained closed. A barrier of police tape was wrapped around the building. But what struck me most were the memorial signs that still hung in store windows. Across from the Tree of Life was a handwritten poster on a fence: "We love our neighbors." In my hotel lobby hung a poster with a Star of David. Now, the normative Israeli response to Pittsburgh was, you see, American Jews thought they were home just like German Jews, but in the end, America is no different from every other exile. And yet, the outpouring of non-Jewish grief over Pittsburgh proved otherwise. The aftermath of Pittsburgh revealed that despite Pittsburgh, America is still different. I hate anti-Semitism. I hate what it does psychologically and spiritually to us as a people and to me as an individual. I feel infantilized by rage, sullied by intimate exposure to the most unevolved members of the human race. I feel my creativity co-opted by their fantasies, my energy distracted by the need to refute their inane accusations. Jew hatred leaks into my soul, drags me back into my fevered childhood. And yet, it's far healthier to deal with reality than to wish it away. And so, for the first time in decades, books on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust once again fill my most accessible shelves. They include books I admire, like Alon Confino's A World Without Jews, and David Nirenberg's Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, both of which make the case for the uniqueness of anti-Semitism among hatreds. And they include books I admire less, like Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, which relativizes and diminishes the Holocaust. Like so many of us, I am trying to understand this moment, what it means, why it happened, how to respond. My starting point is a question that is currently dividing much of American Jewry. Which is the greater threat, the far right or the far left? The question is not trivial. How one answers can determine which non-Jews are considered appropriate allies in the fight against anti-Semitism. The answer depends in part on where the question is being asked. In America today, the most immediate and lethal danger clearly emanates from the far right. When word came of a shooter in the Chabad synagogue in Poway, we instinctively knew he was a young white male who spent too much time on Nazi websites. Still, that profile could change. The next attack, God forbid, could come from radical Islamists. Say a Hezbollah sleeper cell operated by Iran and responding to a crisis in the Middle East, similar to the terrorists who blew up AMIA, the Central Jewish Community building in Buenos Aires in 1994. In France, despite the growing strength of the far right, the lethal threat to Jews comes primarily from radical Islamists. In Poland and Hungary, Jews fear a resurgent far right. And in Germany, they fear the far right, the far left, and Islamists. In England, the very viability of a venerable Jewish community is being threatened by a radicalized Labour Party. Over 40% of British Jews, according to a recent poll, say they would seriously contemplate emigrating if Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn becomes prime minister. As British Jews note, anti-Semitism didn't legitimize anti-Zionism in England as it did in the Soviet Union, but the opposite. By promoting obsessive hatred for the Jewish state, Corbyn has emboldened the anti-Semites, who assume that Labour's culture can now tolerate attacks not only on Zionism, but on Jews and Judaism generally. So far, they haven't been proven wrong. American Jews on the left, who are calling for focusing on the far right alone, and who downplay the dangers coming from the far left, are effectively trying to remove American Jewry from the global struggle against anti-Semitism. The far right at this moment poses the greatest danger to American Jewish lives, but the anti-Zionist left threatens the Jewish people. We Jews are a story we tell ourselves about who we think we are. That's why the seminal ritual binding most Jews today is the Passover Seder, when we gather to once again try to understand the meaning of the story we've been carrying in one form or another for 4,000 years. In declaring war against that story, the anti-Zionists seek to undermine the spiritual foundation of our existence. The anti-Zionist left has declared war against the great post-Holocaust achievement of the Jewish people, the reclamation of power. For Israelis, that process took the form of hard military power. For American Jews, the soft power of political lobbying and coalition building and strategic wielding of philanthropy. Now, both Israeli hard power and American Jewish soft power are being targeted as illegitimate. Those committed to the well-being of the Jewish people must not minimize the nature of the threats we face from any direction. Now, I confess that after Charlottesville, I dismissed American Jewish fears of the far right, recalling my own childhood obsession with Nazis. So what if a few hundred young men marched with torches? They've always been there, they always will be there, simmering on the margins. But then came Pittsburgh, and then came Poway. And in synagogues across America, Jews now anxiously glance at the entrance and wonder who might be coming. How we deal with the complexities presented by anti-Semitism will help define Jewish life in our time. Thank you.
So, thoughts?
I guess I've started with the question, when was this lecture talk given?
The course is about a year and a half old, 2 years old. I think it came out just before, or it was recorded just before COVID.
Okay. I was trying to figure out what he was saying with regard to what's happened since on lots of fronts.
Well, if it was recorded today, it would have to include several more points on the geographic maps, right?
Right, right. Absolutely.
Like Texas. That is very interesting. When he said that Judaism is connected to Nazism, because that's exactly what Putin is saying now about Ukraine.
Yeah.
That he's going to, get rid of the
Denazify.
white Nazis.
Right.
And the
Yes, and-
president of Ukraine is a Jew.
Yeah.
Yes. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Also, right, he's bombing Babi Yar. I mean,
Yes.
Yes.
you can't say you're against. It's so convolutedly backwards thinking to bomb Babi Yar in the name of denazifying the Ukrainian government, which is the only government other than Israel in the world headed by a Jew. Yeah, okay, interesting. Bas.
Yeah, I had the same thought as just mentioned, but I was wondering, but maybe this is a question for Dr. Berg, but do we know why the Russians went that way? Why they were targeting the Jewish people as Nazis? Like, what did they gain by that? What is the motive? Do we know?
Well,
Good question.
it's likely the case that that Dr. Burke would have a more sophisticated answer than I do. But my sense of it is that the way anti-Semitism functions is it blames somebody who is not the actual power and redirects the animus of the masses at the Jewish people instead of at the actual government. So in Nazi Germany, which is a very clear example, right? The real problems were underlying economic problems that grew out of the Great Depression and the World War I settlement debts that the German people had when they lost the war, the Great War of World War I. And Germany was in very bad economic state, and Hitler was able to blame the Jews for that, and for all the ills of the world, right? In the Soviet Russia, there were always problems in the Soviet Union, from from hunger, from every totalitarian state sort of you can blame an outside force, you can have like a war going on to create nationalist fervor, and one of the things that you can do is to hate an other as a way of unifying the rest. And I think that that's part of what was going on. Also, from a political perspective, right, the Jewish state was messing with their proxies, right? It was part of the Cold War. The Americans were propping up the Jewish state, and 1975 is after 67, after 73, right? Soviet Union supplied planes to Egypt and tanks to Syria in both of those wars, and and the Israeli government, the Jewish state, they won, they beat them, and so I think there was a lot of resentment about that too. It was I think when you talk to Labor Party folks in Israel, they experienced Zionism as racism as a complete betrayal, because a lot of that's what killed the Labor Party and what killed the Israeli left and what killed the kibbutzim, right? Yes, kibbutzim weren't economically viable in the long run, But what really killed the kibbutz as a movement was the kibbutzim were profoundly socialist, and they venerated the Soviet Union. And then the Soviet Union went and turned on them in 67 and 73, and in the UN in Zionism is Racism, and it shook the Labor Party, which was the strongest party of the Israeli government from 1948 until 1977, when they lost to Menachem Begin's Beirut, the precursor to the Likud, right? They lost to the right-wing party in part because of this tremendous destabilization of the Soviet Union seeming betrayal of, the idea that like workers of the world unite, right? The Labor Party in Israel just thought, of course, we have everything in common with the Soviets because we're socialist and they're socialist. And it turned out that totalitarianism was stronger than socialism. So I don't know. I feel like that was a lot of different pieces, but to me, it's a complicated story that there's no one piece that tells the one answer to that.
What I'm hearing kind of like a bad excuse.
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah.
I'd like
Anita.
to make one. Yeah, I'd like to make one point. Is Vladimir Putin? He's schooled by the KGB in all of their rhetoric, and here he is speaking about denazification. He's still the KGB operative, with all of their tricks that they use to keep the Russian people in place, and this hits upon a core. I think in the Russian people there is a streak in the peasantry of anti-Semitism. I heard my mother's stories from her time in her shtetl in Belarus of the anti-Semitism of the peasants, of the plain people in her community, and they were no better off. She in her family.
Yeah. Yeah, Gary.
I have there's a couple of thoughts in my mind, but I have a question. Does the local clergy against hate organization perceive a threat of anti-Semitism from both the left and the right?
I'm not sure I understand the question exactly.
Well, there was the discussion that we just heard spoke about both anti-Semitism from the left and from the right. And I wonder if our local organizations perceive things that way as well.
Oh, whether we perceive it?
Yeah.
Well, I would say this. I would say it is much easier for the Schenectady Clergy Against Hate, which is a very progressive leaning group, to see the far right dangers of anti-Semitism. It is much harder for them to see the far left dangers of anti-Semitism. On this issue, I am like maybe the most right-wing person in the group, and find myself fairly regularly, we couldn't hear you, Sonia. I find myself very regularly pointing out left-wing anti-Semitism and warning people of the dangers of anti-Zionism as it bleeds into anti-Semitism. And that is harder for people to see on the progressive left. Our Schenectady Clergy Against Hate group, which I value very deeply and like the people very much, is very much an example of a progressive left sort of organization. Sonia, did you write a question or a comment into the chat? If you do, I will happily read it out loud and respond to it. I'm not sure why your sound isn't
Yeah.
working.
That's frustrating.
Yeah.
The audio isn't working on our side.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Bob.
in speaking to people on the left, and maybe the people who would have been anti-war protesters in the Vietnam era, and younger people of the same leaning. The frustration is that the Zionism is racism, Zionism is apartheid. Palestinians are subject to apartheid. It's just very entrenched. It's very difficult to approach. I would be more, if I were in Israel, I guess I'd be more of a labor supporter, but yeah, it's very frustrating.
Yeah, well, Yossi Klein Halevi sometimes says that in Israel, the failure of the left is sort of not to recognize sort of, I'm not going to say it right, so I'm not going to say it, but he has this really great thing about the sin of the left and the sin of the right, and why he thinks of himself as being very centrist. And I think what you're saying is right? Like there's been an occupation for 50 years. Yeah, Sonia writes, it seems to me that traditionally the Jews have been the scapegoat of Europe and the Black people have been the scapegoat of the United States. Maybe society has a need for a scapegoat. Is the rise of anti-Semitism in the USA perhaps tied to the fall of anti-Black prejudice? I don't think that's true. I think that anti-Semitism and racism are very connected, and that anti-Semites often end up also being racist. It's not like that there's a fall of racism and a rise of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism and racism go together. I mean, Nazi Germany was a profoundly racist society also. It's just that what you are right about is that our American system of looking at the world uses racial categories very strongly. And I encourage you to read the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson for more understanding of that particular topic, which I read last year and found very enlightening. I'll put it in the chat.
Fourth.
I didn't agree with everything she said, but I don't think you have to agree with everything to learn a lot from it. It was a really enlightening take on the American political system and how racism is how we see the world. It's our caste system. I do not think that anti-Semitism is similarly the caste system of Europe. I think that anti-Semitism is much more versatile and broad than anti-Semitism. Jew hatred has different forms in different locations, and like what we say at the Passover Seder, in every generation they've risen up to hate us. There's something really true about it. It's not just Europe, it's everywhere. Which I guess is a little depressing. So sorry about that.
Yeah, because it was sanctioned by for so many years by Christianity.
Well, that is definitely part of it, right? And then for much of the last century, it's been sanctioned by many Islamic countries as well. But it's not just Christianity and Islam. It's also communism and socialism, right? Like the fascism, right? Every ism, even globalism, right, has its own version of anti-Semitism.
It's because we haven't gone away.
And human rights, right? Yeah.
They want us to go away. They've wanted us to go away for 2,000 years now, and we haven't gone away. We're still there to wag our fingers at them and say, we're here, and and we want you to do better.
Right. Like Yossi Klein Halevi said in the lecture, under pre-Holocaust Christianity, the Jew was Christ killer. Under Marxism, the Jew was capitalist. Under Nazism, the Jew was race polluter. In the era of universal human rights, the Jewish state became the embodiment of racism and colonialism. Right? In every generation, whatever the worst sin is of that generation, that's what the Jews are accused of being.
When the Women's March was being put together, it was a real struggle because many of us as feminists were very much trying to put it together in a way, however, that some very, very ardent women, still part of the group, but were very anti-Zionist, which I and other people who I know have been much, much more involved in the organizations than I have been, say, well, you say anti-Zionist, but you really mean anti-Jew. It's just a way to make it sound better. It just makes it sound better.
Well, that's definitely the way, like what he described as in Corbyn in England. It is true that Corbyn's anti-Zionism has provided cover for a huge resurgence of British anti-Semitism.
Right.
Right. In our country, we saw it the other way, right? Like, that is to say, in some ways, right, Trump's pro-Israel, pro-Zionism, but incredibly divisive his being pro-Israel, like, emboldened the anti-Zionist left-wingers and let them gain greater power in the Democratic Party because they could position themselves as being anti-Trump and anti-Zionist, and it was seen as a good thing. So there, right, sort of, it was kind of the reverse, right? The less of a Corbynization and more of a sort of the right-wing pro-Israel, pro-Zionist gives way to a left-wing anti-Zionist response. It's interesting. I mean, like he said, a lot of it depends on where you are in the world. What you see as the greatest threat. What did you guys think of his treatment of the UN?
Pretty mild.
He summarized what
He
went
summarized.
on, but he didn't render too many opinions about it.
Did you guys know that the UN, that 78% of UN condemnations are against Israel, even though Israel has less than
I didn't know the
0.1%.
numbers.
Yeah.
0.1%.
I didn't know the numbers, but
It
certainly the
seems like
balance.
the only country that they criticize is Israel. They don't
Right.
see anything else around the world but Israel.
Mhm.
It's their concentration. And I think that's because a lot of the representatives in there are Arabs. So that helps.
As it were, yeah.
Yeah, but some of these new alliances may dampen that.
I think that's very likely. Yeah, Gary. You gotta unmute.
I have some thought that even though there's a lot of UN condemnation, that a lot of people don't perceive that the condemnation as sincere. That it's, political convenience. I don't know if that helps, but I'm not sure that they perceive the arguments in the attack as sincere, but rather perceive them as perceive them as matters of political convenience.
And they're aligning themselves with a particular faction to gain something from that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Mhm.
For political reasons. Yeah.
I personally lost all respect for the UN. I mean, I don't think they have any, credence to anything. It's just lip service, moving them out and talking.
Well, given the fact that the Soviets have, the Russians have veto
Yeah, have
power.
a veto,
Power.
yeah, especially now.
Ain't nothing gonna
Right.
happen.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so any other comments? Then we're gonna watch this interview. All right, so the interview is Yossi Klein-Halevi interviewing Yehuda Kurtzer. And you'll see in the interview, one thing that I found was particularly interesting. Yehuda Kurtzer, unlike Yossi Klein, right? Yossi Klein-Halevi described his personal journey of anti-Semitism and the way that being a second generation Holocaust survivor, right, affected his, his constantly sort of thinking about his childhood demons and his father's anti-Semitism and, what it means to be the child of survivors. And Yehuda Kurtzer has 4 American-born grandparents. So in a some sense, right, Yehuda Kurtzer, he's, I don't know, 10, 15 years younger than the Yossi Klein-Halevi, but he comes from maybe a different worldview, a different way of thinking. I have to say that I have all of my great grandparents were born in this country. And all of my grandparents, all of my great grandparents, and some of my great great grandparents were born in this country. Now, partly that's the short generations in my family, right? Like, if a generation is 20 years instead of 30 years, like that's part of it. But I'm the oldest of the oldest of the oldest. So, right, like on my mother's side of the family, like my grandfather's the oldest of 5 and my mother's the oldest of 5 and I'm the oldest of 4. So like I'm the shortest possible generation on that side. So that's part of why I was born with 5 living great grandparents and other stuff like that. I still have 4 living grandparents, which is a huge blessing, and most people my age don't. But I think Yehuda Kurtzer like really feels like he comes from a profoundly American Jewish perspective, and his critique of Yossi Klein-Halevi is really interesting. Well, I found Yossi Klein-Halevi compelling. Listening to him talk, I was like, yeah, like there are, like, we have to not minimize anti-Semitism from the left or from the right. Yehuda Kurtzer comes at it from quite a different angle, which I think you'll appreciate. So here we go.
Oops, hang on.
Today we'll be discussing the resurgence of anti-Semitism on the left and the right, and its consequences on Jewish peoplehood. And joining me is Yehuda Kurtzer. Yehuda, always a pleasure.
Thanks, Yossi.
You have made it a centerpiece of your teaching and your leadership to try to get us to move past fear and embrace the opportunities of this moment, both in American Jewry and in Israel and Jewish sovereignty. And yet, many of us today are deeply afraid. What worries you today? Do you share any of those anxieties that really define so much of what has become contemporary Jewish conversation?
Sure. So, Yossi, in your lecture, you talked about your own upbringing and your own background as having grown up in the shadow and in the immediate memory of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and the ways that that shaped your consciousness of being someone who was inheriting the trauma of the previous generation, and in many ways looking for and identifying resurgences of that trauma in your lived experience. Speaking personally, I didn't grow up with that experience. I grew up with 4 grandparents born in America, which is actually radical in the 20th century of the Jewish people, relatively speaking.
Especially in Orthodox society.
Yeah, so that was a big feature of it. I grew up as a Jew in relationship to the state of Israel, born in a period of relative security and prosperity. And as a result, I want to acknowledge that my own personal memory of trauma is different than yours. And I think that that's actually a big under-articulated story for the Jewish people, is that we think this is just about collective memory, but actually personal memory and family often shapes our own fears. I want to be clear. I acknowledge the existence of anti-Semitism. I know enough about history and I care enough about memory to know that it's there. I genuinely believe when we say in the Passover Seder, in every generation they rise up to destroy us. I don't know about the next part, which is that we don't always get saved, but I do believe that this is an enduring story. But you're right, I have tried to spend most of my career trying to get our community not to fixate on trauma and fear, not to fixate on that kind of paranoia. And part of the reason for it, I guess, is fears are never falsifiable. A fear-based approach to Jewish life can always be corroborated. You can always find some data in the existence of anti-Semitism and hate against Jews in the world to confirm that you should be scared. And it also strips us of our moral agency and responsibility. So since I know that in some ways anti-Semitism is never going to go away, since I know it exists, I'm trying to figure out, how do I live as a Jew in the world knowing that it's there and not letting it dominate us? And I wonder, Yossi, I want to flip the question back to you. Since you think about this so much, since in your lecture you talked about the ways in which it almost like the Soviets picked up the mantle of the Nazis, is there ever a moment when you say, like, enough already? I know that you're there. I know that you're out to destroy us, but I refuse to allow my paranoia about you to become dominant in my own identity.
My personal problem is that I went through that stage. I reached the point where I said, I am now free from this paranoia for certain, but even justifiable fear will not determine how I live and think as a Jew. When my first child, my daughter Moriah, was born, this was in 1985, I collected all of my Holocaust books and I symbolically moved them from a lower shelf to a higher shelf. I didn't want her crawling around and pulling out the photo album of Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
That was all symbolic. And yet, for me, it was really one of those crucial moments where I said, this is the dividing line. My life is not my father's life. But the irony that I'm experiencing now is that so much of the Jewish people is now where I was when I was a kid. And the fear and the obsession about anti-Semitism, again, I think we need to make a clear distinction between unhealthy fear and a healthy willingness to deal with threat. And so my question to you is, what are your parameters for defining threat, defining credible threat, and how do we deal with it?
So part of why I sit where I sit and what I'm anxious about in the resurgence of anti-Semitism is, and I know this is a loaded phrase, I feel like there's an industry around anti-Semitism that is constantly monitoring it, fixating on it, in weird ways actually amplifying it. Deborah Lipstadt talks about this in her new book on anti-Semitism, where she says we have to figure out how to fight anti-Semitism without amplifying it. But I find that so much of the current conversation about anti-Semitism actually just gives it a bigger platform and gives it more noise. I think social media has done this in a really destructive way. I think there has to be a way that we obviously have to be vigilant in our communities around security. We have to not falsify the fears of Israelis when they talk about their existential threat. But I'm still on the other side, and I know you're pushing me towards how to name where this fear actually is and what it's about, but I just watch the way that it exhausts the totality of community discourse.
So let's look at BDS for a moment. I actually think that BDS is not a threat or a significant threat to Israel, but I do believe that it is a growing threat to the diaspora. My fear is that BDS will set back American Jewry by 2 generations, back to that point of acute American Jewish self-consciousness in the public space. The great victory of American Jewry in the last generation or two was overcoming Jewish self-consciousness. You didn't have to worry about, am I being too Jewish in public? Am I speaking with my hands? Am I saying anything inappropriate? It was in my generation that I saw the transition. And your generation grew up without that self-consciousness. BDS threatens to restore American Jews to that point where you will be asking yourself the question in certain public spaces, in progressive public spaces, is what I'm saying right now appropriate? Is this too Jewish? Is it Zionist? Is it going to mark me in some way as unacceptably other? Now, BDS is not really threatening the Israeli economy. In fact, there seems to be a direct proportion to the more BDS activity there is, the more the Israeli economy grows. But now I'm worried about you, worried about American Jewry.
So if that's the case, Yossi, why is there so much noise about BDS from the Israeli government? In other words, do you think that they think that BDS is a genuine source of existential threat to the state of Israel? Do you think that BDS is fundamentally anti-Semitic? Because I can actually understand if somebody says, if you believe that this political movement is anti-Semitic, and part of the job of Jews in the world is to combat and defeat anti-Semitism, then you feel enlisted in it. But it's actually confusing to say this isn't really a threat to me. And on that, I agree with you. The data about the movement is actually quite weak. It's had very few real accomplishments. It has some symbolic accomplishments. But if that's the case, why do you think our community is so invested in fighting?
All right, so look, I think that the argument can be made that the real threat of BDS to Israel is not economic, but conceptual. BDS risks raising a generation of future leaders in the West who view the very word Zionism as illegitimate. And that could have strategic consequences for Israel down the line. So in that sense, I hear the argument that's made in Israeli government circles that we can't ignore this because this is a long-term thing. It's not an immediate threat. But I see this as an immediate threat to the diaspora. Now, if we had a healthier diaspora-Israel relationship, we would be having this conversation not only between the two of us, but within the Israeli government and between the Israeli government and Jewish organizations. That conversation isn't happening.
So here's what makes me cynical about the project of fighting BDS as it's coming from the Israeli government. I actually get why a government wants to fight delegitimization movements against its country anywhere. I don't discredit the government for trying to make that effort. But what I am fearful of is that there actually is very little space in the American Jewish community on the left, especially in the progressive left, as there is increasingly in Israel, to be a principled, outspoken critic of the government's policy without being tarred as being a self-hating Jew, an anti-Semite, or being anti-Israel. I think it's actually in the interest of a right-leaning government to keep that pressure up. And therefore, maintaining the noise around BDS as an effort forces American Jews constantly to make these choices. In that respect, actually, the fight against BDS and what you described as BDS itself are both conspiring to put American Jews in this impossible situation of constantly having to perform our loyalties and our responsibilities. Partly what I would love to see is less focus on this movement. I'm with you. I don't like non-nuanced mass movements that reduce the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to a morality play. I don't like it. I don't think there's been any credible moral claim that BDS has made that their position is more moral by any standing than even that which they're fighting against. I don't want it either. I want more space. I want to be able to say, here's where I stand in support of a decision of the Israeli government, and here's where I oppose it. That's the tool, that's the stuff of relationship. But as it's currently constructed, all we have is this option of either what I find to be an immoral and ineffective political movement to delegitimize Israel, and a totally ineffective and maybe even counterproductive effort to try to tamp down that movement.
Okay, but let's dig a little bit deeper. Is your assessment of BDS, does it go beyond dislike to something more acute? Do you sense that BDS might be constricting public spaces for American Jews?
I think that is absolutely the interest. I think that's the interest of almost any type of protest movement like that, is to try to get people to have to perform their loyalties one way or another, and BDS is not alone in that respect. But I think I want to parse a Talmudic distinction in BDS. There is what BDS represents as a political, in theory, nonviolent movement that seeks to protest the actions and maybe even the existence of the State of Israel. And then there are a whole set of individuals and sometimes organizations associated with the movement. On its face, a movement like BDS is not inherently anti-Semitic and not inherently problematic. Americans have a long and storied and wonderful history of boycott movements, including connected to the civil rights movement, that are not only not immoral, but they are actually tools of civil disobedience. Are there individuals and organizations of bad faith connected to that movement? Absolutely.
All right.
I think there are anti-Semites located in that movement. But we gotta be, this is critical, Yossi, and I feel this very strongly as an American Jew. The response to BDS can't be so, as a movement, can't be so out of proportion that we wind up doing counterproductive things to the very things that make us thrive as American Jews. When American Jews get on board with shutting down free speech laws in order to prevent BDS coming in place, you're cutting off your whatever to despite your whatever. You're actually undermining what has made America a thriving place for Jews, which is free speech in the public square.
Okay, let's take it a step back. Before we get to the conversation about how to fight this, what the most effective or ineffective way to fight this is, let's look at the phenomenon of BDS itself. Doesn't it trouble you that the only international movement advocating the boycott of a country is aimed at the Jewish state?
Yes.
Say more?
Of course it does. That's why I don't support the movement. That's why I oppose it. I also agree with you that there are ways in which the rise of this movement relative to all sorts of other international crises, it doesn't smell right. Here's where I sit as a Zionist in relationship to the story. We have this weird thing as part of Jewish people and as part of Zionism, where we want to be exceptional and we want to be normal at the same time. Here, Israel has this ambivalent relationship to the West. It wants to be of the West, right, in some ways, but it doesn't want to be held accountable of the West in other ways. I think the occupation presents a unique problem in the West.
Mm-hmm.
It also has to do in part with the eyes of the world are focused on this story as a morality play. This has been the case since the dawn of time. This is the cradle of civilization. It happens here. So I think part of the fixation on this story has to do with a whiff of anti-Semitism, the obsession with this, and part of this has to do with the fact that human civilization and the relationship to the West are complicated, and we even have our own ambivalent relationship to whether we want to be different than the family of nations or belong to the family of
I think
nations.
that that's a really important point that many Israelis often overlook, but there's an equally important point that many American Jews overlook, which is that this is not just a story of occupation, it's also a story of Israel finding itself in the anomalous situation, the unique situation of being the only country in the world that lives under a permanent death threat issued by many of its neighbors. We are the only country in the world for whom existence, the right to exist, is an issue. Now, think of how that plays on the Jewish psyche, that 70 years after the Holocaust, we are the only people on the planet that needs to defend our legitimacy, our right to exist. For me, as an Israeli, it drives me mad. And so when I look for a real conversation with American Jews, I'm also looking for an emotional partner here. I'm with you on the occupation, and I'm with you on exactly that point that we can't have it both ways. We can't be part of the club of the West, of democratic nations, and be the only democratic country that's a long-term occupier. But I need you as a partner in the conversation that says, well, we also can't tolerate a situation where it's the only country in the world whose legitimacy is under question is the Jewish state.
So this is something I've learned from you really over the years, which is the ways in which Israelis look to world Jewry not to falsify your fears. I get that. I really have learned from it, and I have changed my approach oftentimes to things that are in the news about what happened in Israel, how's the story playing out, to first try to listen to the voices of how Israelis are responding before I come to my own conclusions and before I act as a referee. This decision was right, this decision was disproportionate. I still sometimes may not agree with my Israeli friends' diagnosis of their reality, and oftentimes I identify with minority voices in Israel who say, you know, even in something like the Iran deal, there were minority voices in Israel who were actually in support of the deal.
Very minority.
But you have taught me, and I've learned from it, to listen to the fears of the Jewish people and to not falsify them. I guess by the same logic, what you're asking for is empathy and to some degree a generosity of spirit in responding to not only our threats, but to each other. Part of the reason I want to make sure that we don't take major groups of people and collapse them into being haters of the Jewish people is in some ways part of the same logic. I don't want to be in the business of walking around the world in this unbelievable condition that the Jewish people are in, deciding that anyone who gives off a whiff of some politics we don't like is anti-Zionist and therefore anti-Semitic, and I'm watching the way that it's happening. I think what you're trying to ask me and pushing towards, and I'm trying to formulate, is I'm interested in a conversation not of is anti-Zionism or is BDS anti-Semitic. I'm interested in a conversation of when is anti-Zionism and anti-Semitic. When does BDS cross over? And I want the reciprocality that I want from Israelis is to listen to us saying, we're trying to hold a line as American Jews in our support for Israel, our criticism of Israel. We're also trying to hold relationships in coalitions with other people who have more ambivalent relationships to Israel. But when we are forced to paint with too thick of a brush in broad strokes of anyone out there who it sounds bad, that we have to treat them as being our enemies, it puts us, I think, all of us in an untenable position.
Okay, but there's a distinction between ambivalence toward Israel and outright denial of Israel's legitimacy. And for me, that's where the line runs. And my question to American Jews is, are we partners in that distinction?
You know, a few months ago, I had a conversation with a bunch of Israeli friends, Olim, about the gap between us, between American Jews and Israel. They were all living over the Green Line, living in a settlement, and I went out there to talk to them because I was I'm really concerned. In general, I believe that we should find more ways to be talking to people who we don't have automatic agreement with. So I went and talked to them, and I went to listen. And the question I asked them was, I talked to them about American Jews distancing from Israel, what that's about, and I said, does this concern you, and does it obligate you? And they all said it concerned them, but they couldn't come up with any language of obligation for themselves. What they were able to say is, here are all the ways that I feel let down by American Jews. And when I asked them, well, what if I told you that 75% of American Jews, not all, but 75% of American Jews believe that the current president of the United States constitutes an existential threat to what we experience as America, and therefore who we see ourselves as Jews as in America? They went ballistic because they said, no, we like the current president because he's good for Israel.
Right.
And I said, hey guys, you can't have it both ways. If what you're telling me is stop falsifying my fears and stand with me, then why doesn't it actually go in the other direction? And I don't think that the sum total of the question of what's good for Jewish peoplehood can be reduced to how does the state of Israel and its citizens define who are our friends and who are our enemies?
But it has to work both ways. Now, I agree with you, and I feel obligated by American Jewish fears toward President Trump. I take those fears seriously. I think that Trump is the single greatest threat to the post-World War II liberal order, which is precisely the condition that allowed American Jewry to become the most successful diaspora in Jewish history, maybe the most successful minority anywhere. And that's thanks to the liberal order, which this president is threatening. So while I don't believe that this president is necessarily an anti-Semite, I also don't care if he's personally an anti-Semite or not. He is indirectly threatening the well-being, the fundamental well-being of American Jewry.
We have to figure out how to listen to each other and our fears, but that means not painting each other in these big brush strokes that makes it impossible for us to live these alliances. And here, and I think this is a key point of the whole anti-Semitism conversation, especially for American Jews on the political left. American Jews on the political left, many of them believe that anti-Semitism is a real thing. They believe it's a real thing in America. And I think they correctly understand that anti-Semitism in America is less bad, if you want to say such a thing, as structural racism against African Americans. Much less bad
That's
for
known as
American
cold
Jews.
comfort.
Right? Now, what happens is, if the dominant voice from the pro-Israel community is constantly policing who are our alliances, who are our partners, who are our coalitions, around whether they are anti-Semites or not, good for the Jews or not, it strips away our capacity to actually be involved in a serious way in the battle for racial justice. And it actually reinforces anti-Semitism because it says to our partners, the Jews only care about their own fate.
Right. I think that this really touches on a basic conflict between how Israelis view the resurgence of anti-Semitism and how American Jews view it, which is, do you view it in an American context primarily, or in a global Jewish context primarily? And depending which way you tell that story will really help determine how you choose your allies and whether you really see this threat as a resurgence of an existential threat, or as something that is more than a nuisance, has become lethal in some ways, but is still, as you put it, far less of a threat to the Jewish minority in America than the threats that other minorities have to contend with. And there's no way to resolve this because we sit geographically and psychologically in totally different contexts.
Look, I do push my friends on the progressive side of things that if their definition of anti-Semitism is entirely restricted to white nationalism, then it's going to make what happens in France inexplicable and incoherent.
Yeah, they're
and they
pulling
have to-
themselves out of a global
That's right.
Jewish context.
And I tell them, any definition you come up of anti-Semitism has to incorporate expressions of anti-Semitism in the world that are inconvenient, right? You're going to have to tolerate anti-Semitism includes, a Palestinian axe attack in a synagogue in Har Nof. That's part of this story. It includes the shooting in a Paris synagogue, et cetera. And that is actually hard for American progressives because they have, in many ways, aligned anti-Semitism as part of a family of hatreds under white nationalism that makes you have to contort it to make sense of why it exists in the Muslim world. I'm with you on that. What I would say, though, and it was very jarring in reading your lecture and hearing it, when you talked about what makes you scared, what makes you more scared. American Jews are more scared of white nationalist anti-Semitism in America because they're the same, actually for the same reasons in reverse that you talked about why you're scared of anti-Semitism on the left, the denial of our narrative, the attack on Jewish peoplehood. I think there are reasons that American Jews should be fearful primarily of white nationalism because it's actually a threat to our bodies. And in that respect, that's why I find the competition, left is worse, right is worse, so unbelievably silly, because when you've partisanized anti-Semitism, you've diminished the collective capacity of the Jewish people to actually fight it.
So the good news is that both threats are serious.
The good news, bad news is both threats are serious. And you asked me at the beginning, Yossi, what makes me scared? This is what makes me scared. What makes me scared is that the conditions of Jewish thriving in America and Israel are actually forcing us to choose between our fears. And a strong Jewish people would recognize that its strengths could actually be leveraged compatibly to recognize that both of these things should make us nervous. That actually anti-Semites on the right and anti-Semites on the left are allies, but that we collectively have enormous capacity, potential, friends in the world, allies in the world, to be able to combat this more effectively. So I would say ultimately I'm a little bit less scared of the anti-Semites themselves, and I'm more scared that the way that we are approaching anti-Semitism is diminishing our collective capacity to defeat it.
Yehuda, truly a joy, and there's no one else that I'd rather argue with more than with you.
Likewise, thank you, Yossi.
Thank you.
So like I said, I think Yehuda Kurtzer comes at it with a very different approach. Sophisticated, clearly more left-wing, progressive than Yossi Klein Halevi is, and also, right, deeply American. Did you also resonate with what he said?
Well, I certainly do. And I'm not, nobody has accused me of being on the left in the past. I think he expressed the concerns about fanning the flames of anti-Semitism and in every situation. I think that sometimes we give more publicity that creates greater concern than the act that was committed. And that's one thing. The other, I think, to the very end, what keeps him, he said, a little bit, not a lot, worried, is it prevents us from forming a stance that will let's say, allow us to function in our society as part of a peoplehood in a nation in which we consider ourselves as equals. And so I think we need to take that into consideration. The other thing is, interestingly enough, I apologize, I don't mean to dominate it, but I wanted to express that, is that the issue of anti-Semitism did not raise the root cause of anti-Semitism. I think they should have expressed somewhat what they thought was the cause of anti-Semitism and why we still don't get a handle. And I mean, I've read a number of essays and books involving anti-Semitism, as I mentioned before, about Constantine's sword really gives a religious background for it. But why is it continuing today? And I would say that also in small fringe groups that we perhaps give them amplify their cause when they're not worthy of being amplified. And now my ankle is very sore from being kicked.
Steve, you weren't there for the first part of the lecture. I'm curious if the conversation, if you had any thoughts or reflections.
Nothing that I can readily articulate right at the moment. Let other people comment first.
Any other thoughts? Yeah, Gary.
There's been a thought that has been running through my mind throughout this series. And it sort of struck me in particular with this one as I was watching the discussion in that, in that comfortable office and thinking, all right, so suppose that instead of this conversation taking place in that comfortable office, it was taking place in a bomb shelter. That in a sense, I feel like there's the threat is perceived differently by Israelis, and that these discussions might seem overly intellectualized.
Yeah, I mean, bomb shelter, sure, or right in Pittsburgh, in the year and a half after the shooting, or I think in some ways, right, the Hollyville thing that happened a few weeks ago, if it had turned out differently, right, like our conversation today would be pretty different, I think, than it has been today, right? Like, you don't have to be in a bomb shelter in Israel to feel the direct attack of anti-Semitism, right? And I think your point is well taken, right? That we are sitting from a position of relative security in the world right now. Even in Israel right now is one of the most safe and secure times to be an Israeli in the history of Israel. Yes, there are sometimes bomb threats, and you have to run to a shelter. Not so often, but sometimes. But the Iron Dome missile defense system prevents, the deaths that would otherwise occur. That is a very effective system at preventing civilian deaths.
Yeah, I don't entirely agree with that. I was just smiling there for a minute because I was thinking during my time in Israel, I was walking around all sorts of places and I thought, I feel quite safe here, except of course that someone might rush up and stab me for no reason at all. But I also think it's worth thinking that the threats, I mean, I'm making it sound like I'm more sensitive about this than I really am. These are just the thoughts that are coming to me at this moment. I don't think you should limit the threats to being entirely physical. I think they can be social as well. There's the capacity for threatening, your positions in the community, your ability to speak your mind, and so on.
Terrorist doesn't have to be bombing just to be keeping you fearful. That's the terror, is what could happen, not just actually what would happen. I actually felt that comment about whether it's a bodily harm or not to be very effective in getting my hackles up in a way. Yeah, that's really what scares me. Yes, I don't like hearing the talk that sounds so ugly, but the fact that there could be somebody talking like that with a knife in their hand is what's personally scary.
Yeah, Bob.
Well, one thing that I resonated with what he said, it's been a bothersome thing for me over the years, is that you need to be free to critique what Israel does without immediately going, well, are you against or for Israel, somehow or other. I disagree with many American policies. I agree with many American policies. I should be able to do the same with Israel, and not be latched on to one anti-Semitic camp or another. It's important to be able to honestly and objectively look at what the country is doing, and this being backed into the corner like that, the way things are sometimes, prevents that from happening, prevents discourse from really going forward.
Yeah. Murray.
We need to address the issue of the United Nations and its myriad of resolutions against Israel, not addressing other equally or even greater issues in other countries. And that may be one of the reasons why it keeps anti-Israel, which may morph into anti-Semitism on a global scale, as they keep alive before the whole world, hammering away all these resolutions, whether in the General Assembly or in its various organs, the committees. It's also only Israel commits, only as Israel is doing all these things. And, as one said, keep saying a lie and doesn't become a lie if somebody believes it.
Yeah. I want to read what Sonia wrote, which is, because she can't speak herself for technical reasons, which is, on a personal level, having lived in Colorado, a state with few Jews for 37 years, I've come across two types of anti-Semitism. Some people have had very little contact with Jews and are open to learning more, and others seem to have a need to feel superior, which is stronger than their sense of logic. I've also spoken to several people who learned everything they knew about Jews from clergy, and that information is generally negative. I spoke to several people in Colorado who said they had never spoken to a Jew in their life until they met me, and I met a few Jews who said, I'm Jewish, but don't tell anybody. Yeah, there's a big Jewish community in Boulder and a big Jewish community in Denver. But I imagine that in other places of rural Colorado, it's less. certainly there's a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of that misinformation continues to come from the church, as much as we wish that weren't the case. I felt that, for me, Yehuda Kurtzer's point that when center-right and right-wing Jewish institutions and Zionist institutions and Israeli Jews push the American Jewish progressive left to preference their Zionism over all of their other identities and force them to choose between their fears or choose between their hatreds, it does create a difficulty in working to combat some of the other deep hatreds in this country, including anti-Black racism. And I think that that's right. I spoke last week about the way in which I was accused of being a prop in smashing anti-racist work in the name of Zionism, and I do think that that is happening. I do think that is happening. And I think that Yehuda Kurtzer is right that increases anti-Semitism, it doesn't decrease it. Yeah, Steve.
Having also had, some experience with the left wing, I'm not sure how much the anti-Semitism of the hard left of the United States is responsive to what Jews do or don't do. They're going to hate us anyway. And so I'm a little reluctant to say, well, we have to put up with anti-Semites because they'll hate us more if we don't. I think we should do the things that are right, and I think we should not do the things that are wrong, and we should call out the people who are anti-Semites when they are. And I'm not sure that there's any elasticity on this question of our behavior changing their views.
That's an interesting point. That probably the same could be said about anti-Semites on the right.
But not in American universities, because we don't have anybody on the right anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, right? Like the progressive left, especially in academia and the public discourse in this country, has been very good at shutting out alternative voices. Which is so unprogressive.
It is really hard to find pro-Israel voice on campus.
Yeah. Seems so illiberal in some ways, but it's done in the name of progressivism. Alas for the discourse. Yeah, Gary.
There was just another thought that I had about the relationship between racism and anti-Semitism. It's a little different perspective. I'm not sure it's entirely relevant, but it seems like we're talking about it, and so I thought I would just toss it in. I think some people here know that as a teenager, I had a summer job quite often in a small Tennessee town where they had where there was a lot of bigotry. And then, of course, I left, and I didn't hear anything more about this little town until decades later, when I learned that the middle school there had decided to build a very nice Holocaust memorial and museum. And it struck me at first as so odd that this town, where the biggest problem was Klan activity and racism, would be building a Holocaust memorial. But it occurred to me that, in a sense, it was easier for them to deal with anti-Semitism than it was for them to deal with racism, because there weren't any Jews around. there were plenty of Black families around, but there weren't any Jews around. And so that was just an easier way to go.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for the great conversations this evening and for challenging ourselves to think really deeply about this issue.
Mhm.
And for taking this the approach to anti-Semitism, which last week we really focused on anti-Semitism as it divides the Jewish community, and anti-Semitism as it divides the Jewish community, and today really tried to understand what's going on with anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as they come together. Another big piece of Jew hatred throughout the centuries is the accusation of dual loyalties. And that is what we're going to look at together next week in Unit 10. Next week, March 10th, is we're going to meet. And then the following Thursday, we will not meet because it will be Purim. Well, I mean, Purim will be over, but I'm not going to do class on Motzei Purim. We're going to skip the 17th. And the week after that, the 24th, I will be traveling to my grandparents' 71st wedding anniversary celebration in St. Louis. And so I will not be here, but I encourage you to come to the program that is going to be happening that evening, which is the third in a series with Rabbi Art Waskow, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who's going to be talking about the name of God as the breath of life and the importance of the environment and thinking about preparing for Passover. And I think that's going to be a really great session. And he's a very interesting person and worth spending some time with. So that will be the 24th. And so we're going to do dual loyalties next week, and then we'll meet again on, I think, what is the last day of March, the 31st. The very end of March, we'll go on to the next unit, Unit 11. So I look forward to joining with you next week to talk about the accusation and dilemma of dual loyalties. Erev Tov.
Erev Tov. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. Be well.
Thank you.
You too.